Hello, welcome back to the continuing series on Bergson and his holographic theory of mind. This is part 9. We'll be talking about free will and voluntary action, to include the possibility of action in altered time or altered time scales, the notion of images as driving action, and the notions of causality and force, especially then the force behind our will and our intent and our acts. So, in Bergson's day, Herbert Spencer was the great exponent of the mechanistic view of the universe, and Henri was his devotee. For Spencer, the universe was a giant machine, and of course then humans were small machines in the giant machine. And this entire notion of the machine is based in the classic metaphysic, abstract space and abstract time. And this is what Bergson saw through. What he saw was that Spencer and the classic metaphysic was an entirely inadequate view of the nature of time, and that all arguments on free will are based on this fundamental issue of the nature of time, and ultimately all rest in the classic metaphysic, which is an utterly unexamined abstraction. So Bergson would encode all this, shall we say, in his doctoral thesis, Time and Free Will, in 1889. The implications then were extended in Matter and Memory in 1896. Curiously enough, in all current discussions of free will, Bergson fundamentally does not exist. It's as though he never wrote the book. And the unexamined abstraction, the classic metaphysic, abstract space and abstract time, is what reigns supreme beneath and permeating these discussions. We discussed in part 3 of this series how perception must be the display of possible action, that is, the notion of virtual action. We noted, for example, that Mr. Cat is in our picture there, watching the mouse run across the floor. In a higher energy state, would perceive the mouse moving more slowly, precisely because his perception must be coordinate with his action capability. To be ecologically valid, his perception must be displaying how he can act. And in the context of the fly, our buzzing fly of normal scale, we noted that as the velocity of processes would increase, the chemical velocities, for example, the fly would transition from his buzzing being at normal scale to a heron-like fly, almost barely flapping his wings, to a motionless fly, and then even further and beyond to perhaps an ensemble of electrons and protons, a cloud that the fly is, and even beyond that. The principle of virtual action, with its intrinsic relativity, envisions a level of integration of perception and action beyond any theory today. I think, as I noted, the standard theory incorporates what's called the perception-action cycle, where we have an external world. We compare the external world to plans, experience that we have, make an act, and see what the change was. For example, here we have our coffee cup. The coffee cup goes to the comparator, looks at various plans for action, generates predictions, makes an action, turns the coffee cup over, and sees if that corresponds to the prediction that was made. And the cycle begins again. But virtual action is far more integral than that. We don't have this series of states that imply perception, then action, then perception again. No robot as currently conceived can implement the virtual action relationship, where perception is the display of possible action and the display of a time scale. In the context of the Turing test, therefore, expanding the nature and method of the test only slightly, we should be able to say to our robot, Mr. Robot, sir, please take this little pill, which contains various pertinent catalysts, which will change your capability of action. Now, please describe your perception. The robot should begin speaking of heron-like flies, or with the robot initially perceiving a cube rotating with sufficient velocity, such that it is a fuzzy cylinder, that is a figure of infinite symmetry. He should now begin speaking of a serrated edge figure of 4n-fold symmetry, for we must continue to perceive by the same invariance laws specifying the event. So should we say, sir, please ingest a little more catalyst, he should begin speaking of a cube that is a figure of 4-fold symmetry in slow rotation. And should we ask him to ingest a bit more of the catalyst, he begins speaking of a stable, motionless cube. And should we ask him now to reach for the cube, he modulates his grasping apparatus to grasp stable edges and sides, as opposed to a cylindrical, rapidly spinning figure. This is what we should expect of a being for whom perception is virtual action. So as I realized these implications of Bergson, when I was working on my doctoral thesis, memories flashed of a favorite topic of my dad when I was a child. My dad loved Ted Williams. Dad was from Massachusetts, and Williams played baseball for the Boston Red Sox all his life. And he was arguably the greatest hitter in baseball. He was the last hitter to hit over 400, 406 in 1941, which is a mark that has not been reached again for over 60 years now, I guess 70, 75 years plus, and counting, despite the interim advent of steroids. He also hit 400s in 1952 and 1953. Now, Dad loved to tell me how Williams could read the label on a record as it spun around on the phonograph turntable. He could also, it was reported, actually see the seams and the spin on the baseball as it hurtled towards him. Dad would tell me how Williams could wait longer than other players before he initiated his swing. So what does this sound like? It sounds, for all intents and purposes, as though Williams was in our higher energy state. Watching a fly, he would have seen it moving more slowly, precisely because he could act more quickly. He could wait longer, quote unquote, to swing because he was seeing in the ball's slower motion just how he could act, just like our cat watching the mouse. It was an expression of the principle of virtual action. In my graduate school days, when I talked about this theory occasionally, friends would respond with similar experiences. One fellow student told me that when he played basketball, on occasion, when driving to the basket, everything would slow down. The motions of the other players, the ball, etc., and he would weave unimpeded to the basket. On other occasions, in baseball, when batting, the ball would slow down and seem very large, and he seemed to have all the time in the world to smash a hit. Similar stories are not uncommon with people in the midst of accidents, such as car crashes. So the question is, or multiple questions start to arise. Was this Williams' permanent physical energetic state? If so, why? Did he have to slow down, so to speak, to talk with normal people at normal scale? Or was it a state that he could voluntarily induce? If so, how? What does this say about the mind-matter relation? In the case of my graduate student friend, it was clearly not permanent. then what brought it on? Simply an excitement, like an adrenaline rush, something that acts like our catalyst, a cause also assigned to the slowdown of events during accidents, or something else? The questions are far larger and more profound than realized. Though if we stay stuck in the sterile computer metaphor of mind, they will never be asked. The problem of voluntary action can be stated simply. How do we will to move our finger? Variants are, how do we will to swing baseball bats? Or leap at mice if we're a cat? Or reach out and grasp wing flapping flies? Cognitive science has no clue today. The answer is far from clear and puts us in the realm of the interface between mind and matter. Of course, in Bergson's framework, we are already given a clue. There is no interface between mind and matter. These are not two different substances, things or whatever coming from incommensurate realities, such that we will never figure out a means of interaction. We have seen that the matter field, in its non-differentiable time evolution, has the elementary attributes of mind, an elementary form of awareness defined throughout via its holographic property, and an elemental primary memory via the indivisibility of this motion. Now, I suspect that as in exploring the depths and implications of this latter statement, that we will develop a truly deep theory of voluntary action. Now, to get a better idea then of what it is that we're trying to solve, we have to go a bit into the very nature of action, or how we act. In this case, the subtopic being the syntax of the act. Now, Carl Lashley, in the 1950s, 1951 in this case, wrote a famous article called The Problem of Serial Order in Behavior. He made some incredibly astute observations back in 1951. Our bodily action involves the unfolding of ordered elements in time. These elements might be the words of a sentence, as we unfold the sentence I'm speaking here, or the various muscular movements underlying a dance step or a tennis serve. The ordering or order of the elements is called the syntax of the act. And as I noted, Carl Lashley, one of the great theorists of psychology, pointed the field initially into the problem in his 1951 treatise. To pronounce the word right, Lashley noted, this consists of three elements, or these elements: the retraction and elevation of the tongue, the expiration of air and activation of the vocal cords. Second, depression of the tongue and the jaw. Third, elevation of the tongue to touch the dental ridge, stopping the vocalization, and forceful expiration of air with depression of the tongue and jaw. He noted that these movements have no intrinsic order of association. No intrinsic order of association. In other words, they're just elements waiting to be ordered. Tire, the word tire, requires these same movements in reverse order, or syntax, to pronounce the word tire. The order is imposed by some organization other than direct associative connections, simply associating things one to another. This is equally true for the letters of a word. The letters R or G or A can occur in any order or combination, gar or rag, etc. The order depends upon a set for a larger unit of action, in this case, the word. So words stand in the same relation to a sentence as a sentence to the letters of the word. Words themselves, he noted, have no temporal valence. By no temporal valence, that he means there is no markers or signature that says this word has to be first, this word second, this word third, etc. in a series. The word right is noun, adjective, adverb, and verb, and has 4 spellings and at least 10 meanings. in the sentence, quote, "The millwright on my right thinks it's right that some conventional right should symbolize the right of every man to write as he pleases. The arrangement of the individual elements or words, the order, is determined by a broad scheme of meaning. This holds not only for language, but for all skilled movements." What then determines the order? Lashley asked. Lashley took the view that the set, or the idea, does not have a temporal order, that all of its elements are contemporal. Thus I read a German sentence, pronouncing the words with no thought of their English equivalents, then proceed to give a free translation in English without remembering a single word of the German text. Lashley stated, "Somewhere between the reading and the free translation, the German sentence is condensed, the word order is reversed, expanded again into the different temporal order of English." So as those who know German realize, the verb always comes at the very end of the sentence, as opposed to English. Lashley argued that the mechanism which determines the serial activation of the motor units is relatively independent, both of the motor units and of the thought structure. Supporting this, he pointed to a series of examples of mistakes of order. He had been tracking typing errors for some time. Misplacing or doubling a letter, typing these, T-H-E-S-E-S, for these, or I-I-I-L for ill, or L-O-K-K for look, he argued, show the order of dissociation from the idea. Show the order is dissociated from the idea. Further, there are contaminations, often from anticipation. For example, typing rapid writing, when thinking, we're typing rapid writing, transposing the W already into the word rapid, or the Spoonerism is made famous by a probably somewhat aphasic Professor Spooner. For example, the Spoonerism, "Let us always remember that waste makes haste," an inversion of order. These latter, he argued, indicate that a set of expressive elements seems to be partially ready or activated prior to the overt act. So he argued there are at least three sets of things to be accounted for: the activation of the expressive elements, the words or the adaptive acts, the components of the tennis serve, the determining tendency, the set or atemporal idea, or the contemporal idea, and the syntax of the act. That is a generalized pattern or schema of integration which may be imposed on a wide range of specific acts upon the individual components of an act. So in the 1960s, the great linguistic theorist Noam Chomsky, inspired by Lashley, would initiate a vast assault on the third point, the theory of syntax, overturning B.F. Skinner and his rats and his simple stimulus response chain behaviorism as he did so, making all the rats unemployed. He proposed a rule system or grammar employed by the brain to unfold the words from the idea in the proper order. The word elements of the sentence, "The man stirred the coffee," are unfolded in a certain grammatical order by a set of syntactic rules, which I'm showing again in the little picture up there. We have our syntactic rules, where a sentence is a noun phrase plus a verb phrase. A noun phrase is a determiner plus a noun, or N. A verb phrase is a verb plus a noun phrase, and then we have the end elements, possible verbs, stirred, attacked, hit, smoked, possible nouns, leaf, building, sidewalk, man, coffee, and a determiner is the words the or a. And we can generate a bunch of sentences via this rule structure, like the man stirred the coffee, or the leaf attacked the building, etc. And of course, I've gone through most of that in this slide, in the previous slide already, what I was going to go through in this slide. The end elements of the rule structure, the nouns, the verbs, the determiners, come from the pool of possible words or symbols in the language. But to me, there was always a profound implication in Lashley that Chomsky appeared to assume, and the subsequent 40 years of cognitive psychology has ignored. At the apex of every diagram is S, the sentence. But what is behind S? Behind S is, of course, the idea. It is the starting point from which every sentence derives its ultimate form, its syntactic structure, its embodiment in specific end elements or words, that is, the components of the sentence, as an action. Behind the idea is a multimodal event and its invariant structure. That is, in the man stirred the coffee case, we're dealing with the invariant structure of the coffee stirring event, which we've discussed in a previous series in great detail with all its invariance laws, the adiabatic invariance, the inertial tensors, the flow fields, the resistances of the medium, etc., all structuring that event. So the idea involving coffee stirring can be expressed in multiple degrees of complexity, richness, and detail. From the sparse, the man stirred the coffee, the same idea could have been expressed as the man quickly stirred the coffee. The old man slowly, painfully stirred the coffee. As the man stirred the coffee, the aroma wafted everywhere. Or the man quickly stirred the coffee with the spoon, clinking away against the cup. In other words, the event is immensely rich, and we can choose to describe it in multiple ways. And that idea of the coffee stirring holds a whole lot of that. The cognitive science has pursued this symbols and rules approach that Chomsky initiated for over 40 years, 57 years at this point. I cannot imagine Lashley being impressed. To begin with, we have ignored his starting point, the atemporal idea. No post-Chomskyan computer translation program, Siri or whatever, and all our subsequent syntactic sophistication has ever translated a German sentence into an atemporal idea, then freely into English. No computer simulation program, in fact, has ever had an atemporal idea. We have had no theory of S, the point from which syntactic structures must evolve in an ordered act. In fact, cognitive science, as the connectionist neural network DORA that we discussed, for example, has tried vainly to reduce its S itself to data elements and yet more syntax. Yet it is from S that the expressive elements must be activated upon which this syntax operates. By that I mean it is from that perception, that experience of coffee stirring, that event, that the expressive elements must be activated. But there's no theory of this activation given the nature of S. In fact, there's no discussion of the nature of S. In fact, if one remembers from what we discussed, S, the coffee stirring event, lies right in the realm of the common sense knowledge problem that artificial intelligence and cognitive science cannot really address. So from this perspective, the attack on the true problem of syntax has not yet begun. Now, Bergson began to address this in the 1920s. He discussed it in an article on dynamic scheme, an article titled Intellectual Effort. He noted that the dream literature is noted for viewing dreams as atemporal forms. Reports from personal experiences describe entire sequence of events taking place in what is apparently fractions of a second in normal time. Bergson describes a case from one individual. To quote, "I am dreaming of the terror. I am present at scenes of massacre. I appear before the Revolution Tribunal. I see Robespierre, Marat, Fouquier to Tinville. I defend myself. I am convicted, condemned to death, driven in the tumbril to the Place de la Revolution. I ascend the scaffold. The executioner lays me on the fatal plank, tilts it forward. The knife falls. I feel my head separate from my body. I wake in a state of intense anguish, and I feel on my neck the curtain pole, which has suddenly got detached and fallen on my cervical vertebrae, just like the guillotine knife. It had all taken place in an instant, as my mother bore witness." The man stirring coffee with a spoon is inherently a time-extended event. However, as a thought, what is its duration? If my intent is to stir the coffee with a spoon, the elements may be conceived as atemporal, in fact, an invariant structure defined over 4D experience. Mozart, it's pretty well known, once reported that in his creative process he could see an entire piece of music, though it belong, as he said, even unto a symphony, as though it were a statue. He was speaking of a time-extended yet atemporal structure. Indeed, though we speak of 4D extended events, the 4D memory of which we have been treating in the series and its events has no particular scale or duration. As I've noted, it's, for all practical purposes, inextended. The detailed theory of the unfolding of an atemporal idea as an act is obviously a challenge. Bergson treated some aspects of this in his treatise on dynamic schemes. Imagine learning to dance, he asked. To do so, we begin by watching people dance. The result is a visual impression of the movement. It's not a precise image, for the image is yet to be concretely filled in, articulated, so to speak, by the actual physically performed movements that will comprise the ultimate fluid action. These movements are elementary units that will be coordinated. Movements used in walking, lifting up on one's toes, swinging the arms, etc. But the first impression, the first visual impression, is an outline of the relations, especially temporal, but also spatial, of the successive parts of the movement. This abstract image of the spatial temporal relations is the dynamic scheme. This abstract scheme, he argued, must fill itself with all the motor sensations which correspond to the movement being carried out. This it can only do by evoking one by one the ideas of the sensations, or in the words of Bastian, the kinesthetic images of the partial elementary movements composing the total movement. These memories of motor sensations, to the extent that they are revivified, are converted into actual motor sensations and consequently into movements actually accomplished. The above passage of Bergson contains, in a nutshell, the deepest questions facing this model, which I have been describing, this model of Bergson, when it comes to the frontier of voluntary action. Firstly, the scheme is not stored in the brain. It is a creature of 4D memory. Now I have a note here on Gunther's book, Mind, Memory, Time, which I would suggest as an adjunct to this whole discussion, a very interesting and profound adjunct. For Gunther is discussing these kinds of questions. For example, how is it possible that a little spider has the action plan to create a web that, if it were scaled at human level, would be a web between 2 trees 90 feet tall, and the web 100 feet wide, and you're facing the tremendous engineering difficulty of getting from one tree to the other with your rope, just to span the first rope, and then to create the incredibly complex schema that is the spider web. And Gunther has tons of these examples, and has actually come to the conclusion again that yes, these schemes are not stored in the brain. They can't be stored in DNA. They have to be stored in the, I'll say, holographic field. So, given that aside, we are again coming to grips with the nature of the whole transforming matter field of which any individual being is a part. Correlatively, it's not for nothing that Bergson's article is entitled Intellectual Effort. He is speaking of the effort needed to transduce an abstract scheme into concrete images which will in turn induce movements. Now, effort is another term for force, and this in turn sets us into the problem of just what force is once we probe beyond Newton's definition. Finally, we have the picture of the images integrally wound causally into the motor unfolding of the act. The lack of this conception in current theory, where the atemporal idea unfolds into action, and the larger vision of the nature of the subject this implies, was the core of a significant controversy, to this day very unresolved in standard literature. In a 1985 study, famous by Lebet, subjects were asked to perform an act, like pushing a button at their will. They were to note the point in time by watching a special oscilloscope display, as we're picturing up there in that little picture. The subject is looking at an oscilloscope display on the table, and at a certain point he's supposed to push a button. And that button the button push was to denote when the subject had felt he had the conscious intent to make the act. The studies reveal that there is a significant buildup of neural activity 300 milliseconds before the time the subject reports the intent to act, or in other words, before he pushes the button. There's already the preparation to push the button before the subject is aware to push the button. Given that the intent is reported after the neural activity buildup, the finding led to an ongoing controversy over the actual role of free will, for it could be argued that the subject has no free will at all and is simply reporting an intent that is nothing more than an unconscious determined action already unrolling. It also led to some bizarre suggestions on Lebet's part, perceived as controversial, a backward referral in time of the intent. But the gradual production of neural processes by an initially unconscious idea, in other words, production of neural processes by an idea, or think dynamic scheme, such that it eventually via this means becomes conscious, is an integral part of Bergson's model. For it is only by this means, the participation in a state of action / processing in the brain, that an idea can become conscious. From this perspective, other than showing that there is much that we do not understand about the unconscious, quote unquote, it is hard to see how Lebet's result is so unexpected. Rather, it is exactly what should be expected in a larger four-dimensional view of mind, where the subject is a time-extended being. And again, in Bergson's visions, where we're actually summoning the intent, coalescing as the image, and that image coalescing as action in the brain, and becoming conscious of that image thereby. In one place, Bergson speculated to this effect. He argued that matter, that is the brain architecture, itself might be delicately arranged, almost as though like a trigger, allowing the image to affect it, causing the mechanism underlying an act to unroll. Now this seems to introduce a point of confusion of real dualism, that is, images acting on, or the mind acting on the brain or matter. It almost seems like a lapse as you read this on Bergson's part, because his indivisibly transforming holographic field is physical and psychical at once, as I took pains to note in the context of the relativity discussion. We're dealing with a continuum. Matter, at the null scale, at one end, the null scale, near instantaneity, homogeneity, and therefore looking very much like the classic metaphysic. And at the other end of this scale, ever increasing time, mind, ever greater condensations of that null scale fly into a condensed buzzing fly at the other end of the scale. But this difficulty, this seeming point of confusion, this appearance of a real dualism, a discussion on Bergson's part of matter being delicately arranged such that an image can cause it to unroll as though it's on a trigger. Again, he noted that the brain is obviously a mechanism that stores energy, and the body, of course, storing energy such that we can unroll actions. And all we need then is this trigger to set the brain off and unroll the whole dynamic scheme, which would be the image of the act, whether it be the dancing or serving a tennis ball or speaking a sentence. But again, this point of near dualism is why the quantum subject is so intriguing, as we'll get to. The notion of images driving an action is anathema to cognitive science. This is precisely because the image neither has an explanation of its origin nor a useful place in cognitive science. Remember, what I'm saying is when the image has no explanation of its origin, it's because there is no theory of perception of the origin of the coffee cup or of the candy bowl in the first place. All is simply data elements and rules. If you remember the discussion about Pylyshyn, why do we need images when we don't really need them? They're redundant. For the neural network arm of cognitive science, there is only strengths of connections between neural network units or nodes. In 1994, however, a theorist named Marc Générod, French theorist, reintroduced the concept of images driving actions in the prestigious journal Behavioral and Brain Sciences. Though he lacked a theory of the origin of images in the first place, Générod was slightly ambiguous, therefore, as to their actual role, for if experience is merely stored in the brain, images are simply generated from these stored elements. What role then do they actually serve? They appear redundant or epiphenomenal. Again, the same syndrome that Pylyshyn pointed to. So is the image causing the physical actions, or are the physical actions causing the image? For the dreaming cat, flicking his tail and twitching his paws, dreaming about the mouse, are the dream images of the mouse driving the physical effects? Or are the dream images merely epiphenomenal? The G-neuron tended to be having it both ways, as I noted, ambiguous. Bergson was unequivocal. He saw the image as an integral phase of the causal flow, starting from the intent to the act. Through the intent, you have intent, image, act. So from the intent to the act, to the image, to the unfolding of the concrete actions. Let's look at the larger context of research that might be needed to get a grasp of this flow from the intent to the action. G-neuron took particular note of the research literature on the real effects of mental imagery practice on motor skill. These studies require the experimental subjects to practice a certain action in their imagination. After some number of these purely mental practice sessions, they are tested to see if they have improved their speed and/or accuracy at the task. The studies show positive results. So, again, some indication that just imagining affects action. But again, we're always facing in the standard framework this problem of what are they other than epiphenomenal, redundant byproducts of the machinery of the brain in the first place. But there are other studies in this context with more radical implications. In the early 1950s, Lynn Cooper and Milton Erickson published the results of a series of experiments they had performed using hypnosis with imagery practice instructions, titled Time Distortion in Hypnosis, an experimental and clinical investigation. The subjects were taught how to self-induce a trance to alter time. In this altered time trance state, they would be asked to simply imagine events, or else practice actions. For the one experiment they did on motor skill improvements in these practice sessions, greatly condensed in time, the results were marginal, yet curious incidents were observed. One subject was mentally watching a movie in his altered time state. He was observed to be making extremely rapid movements with his hand, moving between his mouth and his legs, back and forth. When asked after the session what he was doing, he reported that he had been eating popcorn. The velocity of his actions had been commensurate with the scale of time in his trance-altered state. Another subject, a violinist, was mentally practicing violin passages in altered time. She reported that in this state, she was able to see the whole piece, as though it were laid out as a static structure. Again, we're reminded of Mozart seeing an entire symphony as though it were a statue. In our original discussion of altering the time scale and action within this scale, I relied on the physical effect of catalyst. In other words, actual physical chemical catalyst producing increases in the velocity of processes. But in Cooper and Erickson studies, we're seeing indications of similar effects from what I call the side of the subject. In other words, the side of the object, the brain, the neurons, physical catalyst. But from Cooper and Erickson's side, the side of the subject, mentally imagining in altered time. This is why the source of a phenomenon such as that witnessed in Ted Williams, or my basketball playing graduate student friend, is an open question worthy of serious research. Now, I'm sure that some watching here might be aware of a purported experiment done by Silva, S-I-L-V-A, on the Chicago White Sox baseball team, attempting to teach them to induce altered time to improve their hitting. I'm not sure what became of this or how valid it was, but It's out there. To note for the sake of record here. But to cognitive science, in its limited concept of the brain, this question means nothing. But the studies are very real. How could this be possible? In the end, it will come to this question: what is will, and why is it free? So let's move to free will. The problem of free will, and therefore voluntary action, is intricately tied to the mechanical conception of the universe, as we noted in Bergson and his views of Spencer and his mechanical view of the universe. The penultimate version of this conception was coined by our earlier mentioned physicist, Pierre Laplace. In this, he imagined intellect, now affectionately known as Laplace's demon, which is knowledge of the exact positions and velocities of every particle in the universe at the beginning of time. Given the demon knows the laws that can act on these particles, it can predict the precise, complete state of the universe at any subsequent time. All is determined. There is no free choice or action. The classic scenes for philosophical debate on free will all take place with this Laplacian background. Daniel Dennett in Freedom Evolves accepts this Laplacian deterministic vision completely. Nevertheless, he spends many pages attempting to convince us, in essence, that if we are moving up to the macro level of experience, the world of golf ball putting or making decisions in the stock market, that things are so complicated that we are effectively free. His entire discussion produces one of the great cognitive dissonance headaches ever achieved, as he feverishly attempts to keep our eyes averted from his Laplacian vision, or Laplacian world, which lurks always, driving everything beneath his world of macro appearances. So let's paint a classic picture of the debate. And I'm taking this from Bergson's diagram in Time and Free Will. Before a certain philosopher, there are two glasses of wine, a Burgundy and a Bordeaux. The Burgundy is tasty, but the Bordeaux is good too. There's a moment of hesitation, drum roll. The philosopher reaches for the Bordeaux. He has exercised his free choice. Or has he? Well, we diagram it. Our philosopher has spent a life of wine drinking, action, and heavy philosophizing before reaching this point of decision. We represent this as the portion of the line from O to D, the point of his life up to the decision, D. At D, we picture the oscillation of the decision. Then the path is taken from D to BX, or to B, the recipient of the Bordeaux, or to BY, the Burgundy. That path, D to BY, is equally open, but it is not taken, though it could have been. Or could it? This has been the dilemma. The determinist envisions a form of mechanical oscillation in space at D, almost as a pinball at an island bumper in a pinball machine. Then states that the antecedent causes are sufficient to account for the path ultimately taken. And indeed, there must have been an effect to account for the movement. The free will proponent sees the same oscillation and says no. Both paths were indeed equally possible. Being unimpressed by the fact that a path was actually taken, he effectively moves the self back to its oscillation at D. In doing so, he ignores Laplace's demon. For the demon, there is only one possible path, and the philosopher's choice is that path. Bergson, in his Time and Free Will, argued both are wrong, demon included. The natural symbolism by which we represent this decision process treats the motion of the self, yes, yet again, as though it traversed a trajectory or line in space. It reduces the progress of the self, that is a dynamic motion in concrete, indivisible time, to its residue in space given by a line, the parts of which, like the path of poor Achilles chasing the hare or the turtle, we can then carve up at will into an infinity of points or mutually external states. This lends itself instantly to a mechanical conception of the self and a mechanical statement of the problem. Each state now becomes a cause, like the particle at a position in space determining the next state. But this should give us pause. We have already seen the difficulties, in fact, the invalidity in treating motion via the concept of a trajectory in abstract space. Now, in this projection frame, we saw that the concept of a trajectory begins with the fundamental partition affected by perception within the universal field, dividing it into objects and their motions. Extended in thought, it became the continuum of positions, the completely relative motions of objects traversing sets of points in this continuum, and the loss of all real motion. At stake now, I noted, is a physics which can incorporate real motion. Though we can conceive of objects and their motions, Bergson had argued, why can we not conceive of the whole as changing? It is a global transformation of the universal field, as the turning of a kaleidoscope. The motions of objects become then changes or transferences of state, wave motions within this field. The motion of this whole cannot be conceived as a series of instants or discrete states, but as a non-differentiable melodic flow. In this flow, each moment interpenetrates the next as the notes of a melody, forming an organic continuity. And because each moment is a reflection of the preceding history of the flow, each moment is therefore absolutely new. No moment can ever be repeated because it's the expression of the previous past. But we project backwards upon our conscious experience through our framework of objects in an abstract space. We see each note in a melody as a mutually external, repeatable object or state. 10 middle Cs are struck on the piano in succession. We see the spatial cause, the same finger hitting the same key, producing the same result. Thus, this flow in time becomes divided conceptually into 10 mutually external, repeatable notes. But our actual experience is of an organic whole. If one note is held slightly longer than the others in the melody, the experience, the quality of the whole is changed. The notes interpenetrate, and each current note is a reflection of the preceding notes in the series. It is the conscious experience that is telling us the reality, not the abstraction derived from space. The finger is not the same finger from note strike to note strike. The piano key is not even the same key. The string is not the same string. Nothing is the same in this universe from moment to moment. It is only practically the same. A practicality is defined by a scale of time and action calibrated to perception, a scale in turn defined by the dynamics of the brain. To turn this practical, this middle scale, and the concepts derived therefrom into philosophical gospel, this is the problem. It makes all the difference when we are trying to get beyond customary images relative to our needs, not only in physics, but in a phenomenon so profound as free will. But this framework gave birth to causality as well. Remember, it's causality that's driving the whole notion of determinism. The essence of the concept of causality in the classical framework is repeatability. Causality as an explanatory concept in science is useless if the cause is not repeatable. If I line up a cue ball in the same precise position relative to the 8 ball, apply precisely the same vector of force via the cue stick, I expect the same result. My prediction scheme via Newtonian laws works wonderfully. If I am faced again with a choice between Burgundy and Bordeaux, and all the causes acting upon the physical and biological level are exactly the same, we would envision exactly the same result. I travel down the path from D to Bx. But whence the concept of repeatability? This only has meaning within an abstract time. If I conceive of the motion of the universal field as a series of instants, which is to say a series of instantaneous three-dimensional cubes, where each cube comprises all of space, the entirety of space, then the duration of each instant, or the extent and time of each cube, must become vanishingly small. What scale do I choose for the instant? Physics sees entire lifetimes of particles enduring but trillionths of a second and vastly less. I can descend scales until the duration is so minute, so infinitesimal, that my cube of space exists for so infinitesimally short a time that it is nothing left of the qualitative aspect of the perceived world. In fact, as we noted, I am stripping all quality as I descend. In other words, there's nothing left of the buzzing fly, or even the heron-like fly, or the motionless fly. We're down to an extremely homogeneous bunch of barely moving something or others. The buzzing fly of our normal scale of time becomes the immobile fly, becomes a cloud of electrons, becomes quark events, becomes an ensemble of strings, becomes ultimately so many algebraical relations. I end with a virtually homogeneous, featureless, qualityless cube, then another, then another. I am close to achieving absolute repeatability, for I am absolutely near the concept of quantity. When I count, for example, a set of apples, I strip each apple of any individuality, any differentiating quality, except I will note, as we'll see in the quantum discussion, their position in space. I ignore their individual differences. They are, for this purpose, homogeneous. I am only interested in the repeatability of my counting operation, apple 1 plus apple 2 plus apple 3. But my nearly, taken to the end point of this operation, as far as possible, homogeneous cubes of space appearing one after the other, leave me problems. The ideal limit of the extent and time of each of these cubes is this, as we noted, instantaneity. Absolute instantaneity is again my abstract mathematical point. At this abstract mathematical point, there is again no time. Therefore, as we saw Linz argue, no change. How then do I get cube 1 to transition to cube 2, which has a slightly different configuration of particles, shall we say, then to a new cube 3 with another different configuration, and so forth? I have achieved my repeatability, but at enormous expense. How do I get cube 1 to generate or cause cube 2? How does cube 1 force the existence of cube 2? Or, in other words, how do I bind the future to the present? The truth is, just as both Linz and Bergson argued, I cannot. If the universe can be momentarily static, then it is a universe forever incapable of change. Or I have to posit a process that generates each cube, then the next, then the next. I have a process now in the background that I now have to explain. And this is just another infinite regress. So the universe of Laplace and his demon rest upon this classical causality, which in turn rests on repeatability. I can only predict the positions and velocities of each particle at the next instant if each preceding instant it is utterly homogeneous and repeatable. But I can only attain absolute homogeneity by robbing my cubes of all motion, therefore all extent in time. I end at limit with a universe that is incapable of change. If the abstract notion of repeatable causes falls away, so does the fictitious dilemma of the philosopher and his free or not free, take your choice of wine. That's your free choice. There remains the question of force itself. So there's yet the dynamic conception of binding present to past, dynamic implying force. It is derived directly from our conscious experience. I have an idea of an action, I initiate the action, there is throughout the act the accompanying feeling of effort or force, and the action is completed. The whole sequence from idea to act is experienced as a continuous whole, and by this very wholeness, the act feels prefigured in the idea. Yet it is also our deepest experience that this is not a necessary connection. The act can be avoided if the source of our notion, it is the source of our notion that psychological causes are different from physical causes. But this dynamic picture of causality can in fact easily extend to the material universe flowing in time, similar to our conscious experience, and where the future is not bound by necessity to the past. But this indubitable experience of our consciousness, with its experience of force or effort, is projected upon the external world with our projection system in a mixture with the concept of a Laplace-like necessary or mathematical determination. The dynamic and the static become subtly, unconsciously joined. In the union, Bergson argued, the concept of force is joined with necessity, or a necessary unrolling by mathematical law. Force now determines effects. We then turn this upon ourselves, viewing our own consciousness to the very layer of forms we have projected. The mechanical action of one object upon another, for example, cue ball upon the 8-ball, assumes the same form as the dynamic expression of force and resultant action expressed in consciousness. When I push that cue stick to hit the ball, when I reach the coffee cup, while in turn, this phenomenal experience itself is painted with an algebraic prefiguring and mechanical unrolling via the force that causes it. Now, in the classical metaphysic, we have seen that all motion is relative. An object can move from point to point across the continuum of points or positions, or the continuum can move beneath the object. We have also seen that there must be real motion in the matter field. Stars explode, trees grow, roses unfold. These are real changes of configuration in real systems, and we cannot distinguish parts of that motion which can be relativized. How can we distinguish real motion from that which is merely relative and which becomes rest on a change of perspective? Well, force appears as the natural answer. And as we saw in the relativistic discussion with Einstein in his inception of the general theory, this is precisely where Einstein moved along this natural route, with his elevator as an accelerating elevator also being a force, and therefore a real motion. Force is naturally seen in our classic framework as that which imparts motion to objects. Real motion emanates from a force. But this is the problem, as we saw. Force is only a function of mass and velocity, where velocity is the rate of change of position. Force, or F equal ma, is measured by the degree of acceleration it produces in the body, or mass m. In turn, acceleration is only the rate of change of position. Velocity is the first derivative of change of position with respect to time. Acceleration is but the second derivative. We are always dealing, in other words, only with change of position. In other words, these movements are still relative. The force, one with these relative movements, does not escape this relativity. Force is no more absolute than the movements. It cannot serve to distinguish real or absolute motion. It is not a cause. It is expressed in F equal ma, as physics is cautious to treat it, an invariance law, no more. Thus, as Bergson noted, it is in vain, then, that we seek to found the reality of motion on a cause which is distinct from it. Analysis always brings us back to motion itself. With the same caution, psychology would say that our inner causality has no relation to the mechanical effect of one object upon another. This latter can be conceived as capable of repeating in a homogeneous space, and thus expressible by law. Cue ball repeats hitting 8 ball. But consciousness flows in real time. Its states can never recur. They are never repeatable. They are not truly repeatable, each state being a reflection of the preceding series. Further, as already noted, it must be realized that this is true for the motion of the entire matter field, the field in which our individual consciousness integrally participates, is embedded in. Only at a sufficient level of scale can we treat this field and its events as practically repeatable and subject to classical laws. So, some implications. Firstly, mind is entirely free. The very concept of physical force is derivative, a projected aspect of the psychical, physical evolution over time of the mind-matter field. Our action, from intent to concrete act, participates in this psychical physical flow. This is the fundamental basis for free action, for phenomena such as seen in Cooper and Erickson, likely even the yogis, and the phenomena associated with these types of people. Yet, the details of how an image or a dynamic scheme bring about an act, these are not at all clear. I will carry this, actually both of these issues, the dynamic scheme and its effect, and the flow participation consequence, further in the next part where we deal with quantum mechanics. Because as I've looked at quantum mechanics now again, there are deep implications for the nature of motion, thus our very action when taken in the quantum framework. At the macro level, the level of baseballs, the level of brains, the level of golf balls and putting greens, if one stake, so to speak, in the AI conception of mind is the reconstructive wave nature of the brain or any artificially intelligent device that must be met, that is required for perception, then at the micro level of being, or the same artificial device, QM leads us to yet a second stake. So down the road, we'll look at education and the nature of real understanding of subject matters, for example, like mathematics, physics. I'd like to look at what I call Sartre's fail on Bergson, as this is an example of what can happen, how screwed up you can get over Bergson and notions like his use of images or the universe as an aggregate of images when you don't understand the holographic nature of Bergson's thought. So Sartre did quite an exposition and critique of Bergson's theory, completely missing the point because he failed to grasp the holographic nature. And I'd like to do a short one, a summary, so to speak, of AI's notion of the singularity, popularized by people like Ray Kurzweil, where AI devices ultimately overtake human intelligence and become the dominant force in the world as opposed to humans. And relate that to, of course, what we've been seeing in Bergson's theory as to the implications of the real nature, the real requirements for a truly intelligent conscious device. I find it interesting that I just ran across an article in the recent Discover magazine entitled Artificial Intelligence, Can We Build Machines with Common Sense? And it details the awareness of AI as to their inability to truly handle common sense and their attempts to do so now. And of course, and unfortunately, they're completely missing the point as to what is really required. So a brief summary there. Next time, we'll be looking at the same subject in terms of quantum mechanics, coming back to free will and time in the context of what I think is the best understanding we can get of quantum mechanics at this point. Till then, signing off.